economic blizzard of the Depression was war. Japan had few.
They had been marching for days beneath a sky the color of steel, a gray European heaven that seemed to press down on them like the weight of history itself. When the word finally came, surrender, it wasn't met with shouts or even sighs. It came like a silence, a breath too heavy to release. For the German soldiers who had survived the inferno of battle, the order didn't just mean the end of fighting. It meant the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe: honor, endurance, loyalty to the Reich. In that moment, their world simply folded. They stood in the mud, their uniforms torn, their faces hollow. Some were barely more than boys, clutching boots that had long since lost their soles. Others were veterans of Stalingrad, Normandy, or the ruins of Berlin itself, men whose eyes carried the flicker of too many fires. Word spread quietly among them. The war was over, but what came next was anyone's guess. They expected a camp in France, perhaps, or a prison somewhere in England. But then came the rumor that changed everything. They would not be held in Europe at all. They were being loaded onto ships, massive grey American transports bound across the Atlantic Ocean. For many, it was their first time seeing the sea. The horizon seemed infinite, like a line between old lives and unknown fates. The thought of America stirred confusion and fear in equal measure. What did one even imagine of the land they'd been told was the heart of capitalist cruelty? The journey itself was strange, disorienting. In the cavernous holds of troop transports, the prisoners were packed tight, surrounded by the smell of oil, salt, and sweat. The air was heavy and stale, a fog of bodies and uncertainty. Yet amidst the discomfort, a strange sense of relief settled in. The war, their war, was finally behind them. No more shells, no more frozen nights or frantic retreats. For the first time in years, they could sleep without listening for death. Still, fear lingered. Rumors from Nazi propaganda echoed in their heads. Stories of American cruelty, of torture and starvation, of labor camps and electric fences. They whispered to each other in the darkness. Would they be executed, starved, worked to death? But soon, confusion began to replace fear. The American sailors guarding them didn't act like the monsters from propaganda reels. They were young, almost casual, smoking cigarettes and sharing jokes in a language that sounded brisk but not cruel. Even the meals were strange. Rations were simple: bread, meat, coffee, but compared to the thin soups and crusts of the final war months, it was a feast. The bread was soft. The butter was real. The coffee came in mugs thick as fists. Many of the prisoners ate in silence, unable to reconcile such abundance with everything they'd been told. Was this generosity or some kind of trick? Days blurred into one another. The ocean stretched endlessly, the rhythm of waves marking time better than any clock. With each passing day, the Germans' fear began to transform into something else: curiosity. What kind of country was this, where food flowed even in wartime, where guards laughed easily, where cigarettes were lit not as treasure, but as habit? Some of the older men remembered tales from before the war, stories of American jazz, Hollywood skyscrapers, and glittering cars. But those had always been distant, like fairy tales. What awaited them now was reality, though still wrapped in mystery. Then, one morning, through the fog of the Atlantic, someone shouted from the deck, "Land!" Out of the mist, a skyline emerged. New York, perhaps, or Boston. Towers and cranes rising from the harbor like monuments of a world untouched by ruin. For men who had last seen their cities reduced to ash, the sight was overwhelming. America did not look like a country at war. It looked invincible. Factories belched smoke, not from destruction, but from production. Trains whistled, ships roared, everything moved. It was as if the whole land breathed power. Disembarkation came swiftly, as efficient as any operation they had known. Under the gaze of U.S. military police, the Germans shuffled down gangplanks and onto waiting trains. There was no shouting, no beating, just precision. The prisoners, stripped of insignia, stared at the orderly chaos around them. They were enemies, yes, but not hated ones. That, in itself, was unsettling. The trains carried them inland, into the heart of America. From the windows, they saw wide fields stretching farther than sight, small towns with neat rows of houses, and billboards flashing in bright colors advertising brands they couldn't pronounce. Civilians went about their lives as if war existed only on another planet. Children ate ice cream, women carried groceries, shop windows overflowed with goods. The soldiers looked out in disbelief. In Germany, ration cards dictated every meal, and bomb sirens ruled every night. Here, life seemed untouched, almost arrogant in its calm. The fear of cruelty that had haunted them began to fade. Instead, an unease took its place, the unease of realizing how little they had truly known of the world beyond their own. When they finally reached the camps, many braced for the worst. Barbed wire, watchtowers, orders shouted in a foreign tongue. But what they found was almost disappointing in its lack of terror. The enclosures were secure, but clean. The barracks simple, but sturdy. The organization meticulous. Each man received a bunk, a blanket, a mattress, luxuries compared to the trenches of Europe. The guards were firm, but not cruel. There were rules, yes, but they were enforced with a calm discipline that felt strange to men who had served under fear. The Americans didn't curse or strike, they simply expected obedience. To the Germans, this kind of authority, without malice, was baffling. It was power exercised without rage. Then came the true shock: the food. In the mess halls, the prisoners stood in line with tin trays, receiving meals that would have seemed unimaginable back home. Potatoes, meat, vegetables, fresh bread, still warm from ovens. Some men stared down at their plates as if they were dreaming. How could it be that, in captivity, they ate better than their families did in freedom? The contradiction gnawed at them. They had fought for the supposed glory of a nation that now lay in ruins, only to be fed by the very people they were told to despise. Many could not help but feel shame. Shame at their defeat, shame at their relief. And yet when they lifted the first forkfuls of food, another feeling crept in: gratitude. The Americans themselves seemed like men from another world. They were not the hard-eyed conquerors the Germans had expected. Many were farm boys from Iowa, factory hands from Ohio, men with easy smiles and the faint smell of tobacco clinging to their sleeves. They carried themselves with a relaxed confidence, as if victory was simply the natural order of things. They smoked constantly. Cigarettes dangled from their lips like punctuation marks in conversation. To the prisoners, this was astonishing. Tobacco had been a rare treasure in Germany, traded like currency in the black markets of a dying Reich. Yet here, in the middle of a war, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply. The air around the camp shimmered with the scent of smoke. Sweet, sharp, omnipresent. At first, the Germans watched in silence as guards tapped cigarettes from shiny red and white packs. Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields. The guards offered them to each other with a casual generosity that bordered on wasteful. Sometimes, a half-finished cigarette was flicked away, its ember glowing briefly, before fading into the dust. To the prisoners, that tiny gesture carried a world of meaning. There were other wonders too. The camp canteen, a small wooden hut stocked with soap, candy, postcards, and, incredibly, goods the prisoners could buy with their small labor wages. Cigarettes again, stacked high behind the counter, but it was another object, colorful and unfamiliar, that caught the Germans' eyes. Bright sticks, wrapped in foil and paper, labeled with strange names: double mint, juicy fruit, spearmint, chewing gum. At first, they didn't understand. The guards chewed it constantly, jaws moving rhythmically as they stood watch or chatted among themselves. It was an odd sight. Grown men gnawing on something endlessly, snapping it, blowing bubbles like children. The prisoners laughed quietly, assuming it was some American joke. But curiosity grew. What was this strange, sweet rubber that never disappeared? When a guard offered one of them a stick, hesitation gave way to intrigue. The wrapper peeled back with a satisfying crackle. The gum was soft, sugary, shockingly flavorful. Mint, fruit, something indefinable, but wonderful. Yet the most astonishing part came after the taste faded. It didn't dissolve. It stayed. A sweetness meant not to be swallowed, but savored indefinitely. To men raised in scarcity, the concept felt almost obscene. Rumors rippled through the camp. Some said it was medicine, others that it was made from rubber or wax. A few whispered that it was meant to keep soldiers calm or distract them from hunger. But when the canteens began selling gum to prisoners, curiosity turned into fascination. Men saved up wages to buy it, trading sticks like relics. A single piece could buy a favor or a moment of comfort. Chewing gum and the endless cigarettes that followed became more than luxuries. They were symbols of a world so wealthy it could afford pleasure, even for its enemies. Symbols of a society that had fought a global war without starving its people. Symbols of an abundance that no propaganda could ever explain away. And as the days turned into weeks, the Germans began to understand that captivity in America would not be a story of punishment, but of revelation. Cigarettes and gum, as absurd as it seemed, would become the emblems of their awakening, a glimpse into a civilization that had defeated them not only with weapons, but with plenty. The days settled into rhythm, steady as the hum of cicadas beyond the wire. Morning began with the metallic clatter of the mess hall bell, followed by the shuffle of boots on gravel and the low murmur of German voices, still thick with disbelief. By then, the prisoners had grown used to the sight of the stars and stripes fluttering above the compound, its colors so bright and clean they almost hurt to look at. America had a way of shining, even in captivity. The barracks smelled faintly of soap, pine, and tobacco. Cigarette smoke drifted through the air like a permanent haze, curling lazily toward the rafters, a small defiance against monotony. In the beginning, the men smoked sparingly, each cigarette divided into careful halves, each butt saved and re-rolled. But it did not take long before they learned the rhythm of abundance. Every week, shipments arrived, boxes of rations, canteen goods, and most astonishingly, crates upon crates of American cigarettes. At first, they didn't understand how this could be possible. The war was still raging, wasn't it? Back home, German civilians were digging through ruins for scraps, rationing every crumb, trading everything for a few grams of tobacco dust. Here, in the middle of a land they had been taught to despise, the prisoners were surrounded by plenty so effortless it bordered on insult. And yet, it was not cruelty. The Americans treated consumption as casually as breathing. They smoked because they could, because the supply seemed endless, because luxury was not luxury at all. It was normal life. For the German prisoners, that realization landed like a blow. It was not only that they had lost the war, they had lost the world itself. The camps became microcosms of this strange new order. Each morning, work details were assigned. Some men chopped wood, others labored in nearby fields or factories under guard supervision. They were paid a small allowance, credits redeemable at the canteen. At first, the Germans used it for practical things: soap, razors, stationery to write home. But soon, the logic of the place began to change. Cigarettes emerged as the true currency. They were light, divisible, universally desired. One could trade 2 lucky strikes for a bar of chocolate, a pack of Camels for a favor, 3 Chesterfields for a hand-mended shirt. Within weeks, an entire underground economy was born, organized, efficient, and astonishingly American in its structure. Cigarettes replaced money, but they also replaced meaning. They were status, taste, identity. A man's brand said more about him than his rank ever had. There was something hypnotic about the ritual of smoking itself. The flick of the lighter, the first inhale, the shared silence that followed. In those moments, the camp seemed to dissolve. The barbed wire softened into haze. The guards faded into silhouettes. Cigarettes became time machines, carrying men away from the barrenness of defeat to memories of youth, of pre-war cafes and peacetime dreams. A single puff could conjure an entire lost city. The Americans, of course, had no idea of this. To them, it was just habit, something to do while leaning against a truck or chatting with a friend. But to the prisoners, each cigarette was a paradox, a symbol of both imprisonment and freedom. The guards noticed and sometimes amused themselves by sharing smokes. They would toss a few packs toward the prisoner's side, laughing as the men scrambled, not out of desperation, but out of sheer disbelief that anyone could be so casual with treasure. These gestures were never malicious. They were, in their way, almost friendly. Yet they revealed a chasm between captor and captive that could not be bridged. The Americans could afford to waste. The Germans could only watch and marvel at a civilization that seemed built on endless supply. Over time, the camp itself began to mirror the society that had captured it. There were barber shops, orchestras, even small theaters where the prisoners staged plays. Painters decorated the walls of the mess hall with murals of Bavarian hills and quiet lakes, images of a homeland that now existed only in memory. Yet even in art and leisure, the presence of cigarettes lingered. They were painted into still lifes, exchanged backstage, passed in quiet circles after performances. The smoke became part of the air the camp breathed, a haze that connected the mundane to the profound. Chewing gum, too, took on a life of its own. What had begun as curiosity evolved into fascination. The Germans could not understand how such a trivial pleasure existed in such abundance. Gum became a kind of cultural totem, a small act of rebellion against old-world austerity. Men who had once prided themselves on discipline and order now chewed absent-mindedly, adopting the American habit with a strange mix of irony and admiration. Some even joked about it, imitating the way guards leaned with easy swagger, gum between their teeth, cigarettes dangling from their fingers, symbols of a nation that fought its wars with confidence rather than desperation. Letters home told stories that no one in Germany could quite believe. Prisoners described full meals, clean clothes, friendly guards, even Christmas celebrations with music and gifts. "We are treated well," they wrote, "better than anyone would expect." But between the lines, a deeper truth flickered. something harder to explain. The captivity had not broken them, but it was changing them. Slowly, imperceptibly, the image of America, the enemy, was transforming into something else. It was not love, not yet, but fascination. There were endless debates in the barracks at night. Some men remained defiant, insisting that comfort was a trap, that kindness was only propaganda in another form. "They want to make us forget who we are," one would grumble, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. Others, weary of ideology, simply shrugged. "Maybe we were wrong about them," they'd whisper. "Maybe they're not devils after all." The arguments would fade, replaced by the soft crackle of tobacco and the rhythmic click of lighters. In that haze of smoke, the certainties of a lifetime drifted away, dissolving like ashes in the wind. Outside the wire, America continued on, vast and indifferent. Trains passed in the distance, fields ripened under the summer sun, and the towns near the camps carried on their routines. Occasionally, local farmers would come to hire laborers from the POW population, taking groups of men out to work in the fields or barns. These were the days when the contrast between the two worlds was most striking. The German soldiers, once conquerors in Europe, now bent over rows of corn in the American Midwest, working the soil of their former enemy. Yet even here, the unexpected happened. Respect grew. The farmers treated them with decency, sometimes even warmth. They offered cold water, shared sandwiches, and always cigarettes. The simplicity of it all was disarming. The Americans didn't talk much about ideology. They didn't try to humiliate or convert. They simply worked, smoked, laughed, and lived as though freedom were not something to fight for, but something that simply was. And in the quiet of those fields, the prisoners began to sense that perhaps the true power of America was not its weapons or its wealth, but its unshakable belief in normalcy. The war might rage an ocean away, but here, life went on, unshattered. As autumn arrived, the camps took on a different rhythm. The air grew cooler, and the scent of tobacco mingled with wood smoke. The prisoners grew more comfortable, even content, in a strange way. Some began to study English from tattered manuals or from conversations with guards. Others organized lectures and discussions about what would come after the war. The old certainties were gone, replaced by questions no one had dared ask before. What did it mean to be German now? What did it mean to lose, not just a war, but the moral ground beneath one's feet? And always, the cigarettes kept burning. They punctuated every hour, every conversation, every reflection. They were markers of time, of habit, of survival. The endless rhythm of lighting, inhaling, exhaling became a kind of mantra. It was as if each puff allowed them to release the weight of the past, if only for a moment. By winter, the camp's cigarette economy had become almost comically elaborate. Men with talent for barter were now dealers, moving packs through networks of trade and credit. Others ran makeshift cafes inside the barracks, serving ersatz coffee and conversation for the price of a smoke. There were even rumors of gambling dens where cigarettes changed hands faster than cards. The guards knew, of course, but they rarely intervened. Perhaps they understood that such activities kept the prisoners calm, occupied, and oddly content. It was in these strange, smoky exchanges that something profound began to happen. The Germans were, without realizing it, internalizing the very system they had once condemned. The freedom to choose, to trade, to indulge. It seeped into their daily lives until it became second nature. Cigarettes were no longer just symbols of abundance. They were lessons in capitalism, in choice, in the subtle art of desire. At night, lying in their bunks beneath the hum of electric lights, some men stared at the rafters and tried to piece it together. They had fought for a world that promised order and discipline, yet here they were, discovering comfort in chaos, dignity in defeat. America had conquered them not through cruelty, but through generosity. And in that paradox lay the beginning of something that none of them could have foreseen, a quiet, irreversible transformation of the mind. By the time the news of Germany's surrender reached the camps, spring had returned to the fields of America. The air was soft again, carrying the scent of rain and tobacco, and the prisoners stood silently beneath the flagpoles as the announcement spread from barrack to barrack like an echo from a distant shore. Some cheered, some wept, some simply stared at the dirt as though the ground beneath their boots had lost its meaning. The war was over. Their country, the one they had fought for, the one they had bled and starved to defend, no longer existed. The Reich had collapsed like a dying star, leaving only ruins and silence. For the first time in years, the horizon was clear, but what awaited them beyond it, none could say. Life inside the camps shifted in ways both subtle and profound. There was no longer the same sense of waiting for orders or punishment. Instead, a strange calm settled in, the calm of men whose destinies had been decided elsewhere. The guards grew more relaxed, the routines more lenient. There were rumors of repatriation, of ships that would soon carry them home. Yet for many, the idea of home itself had become abstract. What did it mean to return to a country in ashes, to families scattered or dead, to streets where even memory had burned? For some, the thought filled them with hope, for others, with dread. And so they smoked. They smoked to fill the silence, to mark the days as they dwindled. Cigarettes became a kind of prayer, thin, glowing testaments to the fleeting comfort of the present. In those final months, the camps grew eerily peaceful. The men no longer argued about ideology or victory. The grand speeches of loyalty to Führer or fatherland had vanished, replaced by conversations about ordinary things. Food, family, the shape of clouds, the strange sweetness of freedom that came with captivity. Some of them had learned English well enough to talk with their guards, and those exchanges, awkward, halting, sometimes humorous, became moments of unexpected connection. They discovered that Americans, beneath the swagger and smoke, were simply people, curious, pragmatic, kind in ways that didn't demand acknowledgement. The guards, too, began to see their prisoners not as enemies, but as men. They shared jokes, stories, and more often than not, cigarettes. The generosity of those gestures never ceased to amaze the Germans. Each cigarette offered was a small miracle, a reminder that the cruelty they had been promised never came. The Americans had not starved them, humiliated them, or broken them. Instead, they had disarmed them with decency. It was a quiet, almost invisible triumph, the triumph of a civilization so confident in itself that it didn't need to crush its foes to prove superiority. That realization settled deep in the prisoners' bones. They might have been on the losing side of history, but they were witnessing firsthand what victory actually looked like. It wasn't in parades or speeches, it was in the easy gesture of a soldier offering his enemy a light. As the months wore on, preparations for repatriation began in earnest. The men were given new clothes, medical checks, and small stipends. They packed their few belongings, letters, drawings, photographs, the occasional bar of soap, and of course, cigarettes. Always cigarettes. Some hoarded them obsessively, as if the small white tubes could anchor them against the uncertainty ahead. Others smoked with abandon, as though trying to inhale America itself before it slipped from their grasp. When the first groups finally boarded the trains bound for the ports, the camps fell into a solemn rhythm of farewells. The guards lined up, shaking hands, sometimes embracing the men they had once been ordered to watch. "Good luck," they'd say, with the simplicity of those who knew no better word for it. The journey back across the Atlantic was both familiar and foreign. The ocean, endless as before, no longer felt like a barrier, but a passage, a grey mirror between worlds. The ships were crowded with quiet men, each lost in his own thoughts. Some played cards, others stared into the waves, smoke trailing from their fingers like ribbons of memory. The cigarettes glowed faintly in the wind, their embers tiny beacons of warmth in the cold spray. They were returning to a homeland that was not the one they had left. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were simply men who had seen too much and understood too late. When they arrived, Germany was unrecognizable. Cities once proud and defiant were now skeletal ruins, their cathedrals hollow, their streets lined with rubble. Hunger ruled everything. Hunger for food, for peace, for meaning. The returning prisoners, with their fuller faces and strange new mannerisms, were met with a mixture of relief and resentment. "You were fed by the enemy," some civilians accused. "You lived well while we starved." It was true in a way, and the prisoners had no defense. They had lived through captivity not as victims, but as reluctant witnesses to abundance. It made them outsiders in their own country, men who had glimpsed another kind of world and could never unsee it. And yet, even amid the desolation, traces of America lingered. The habits they had picked up, chewing gum, smoking constantly, using English words like okay and sure, spread like quiet contagions. The cigarettes they had smuggled home became precious relics, traded on black markets for fortunes in bread or coal. But beyond the material, there was something intangible that had followed them back. A sense of possibility, an understanding that life did not have to be defined by scarcity or fear. They had learned, in their captivity, that dignity could exist without ideology, that generosity could disarm hatred more effectively than propaganda. Some of them tried to explain this to their families, to the few friends who would listen. They spoke of the guards who smiled, the farmers who shared food, the canteens filled with things no one back home could imagine. They told stories of how even the smallest acts, an offered cigarette, a stick of gum, had carried more meaning than any victory speech. Most listeners nodded politely, but could not comprehend it. To those still trapped in the ruins, such tales sounded like fantasies. But for the men who had lived it, those memories were real, indelible, and transformative. As years passed, and Germany rebuilt itself, the former prisoners found themselves changed in ways they could not fully articulate. Many of them went on to become teachers, engineers, craftsmen, ordinary men trying to stitch together a new life from the wreckage. Yet beneath the surface, something of that American camp life lingered, like smoke that never quite cleared. They had seen the other side of power, the kind that didn't demand worship, that didn't parade itself in banners and slogans, power that expressed itself in quiet confidence, in abundance so natural it didn't need to boast. They had learned that true strength could afford to be kind. In later years, when the world had moved on and the lines of the Cold War divided East from West, those former prisoners found themselves almost unconsciously sympathetic to the new idea of America, not the propaganda image of Coca-Cola and Hollywood glamour, but the deeper, subtler idea of freedom wrapped in ordinary life. For them, America would always smell of tobacco and mint, sound like laughter in a language they once feared, and look like sunlight spilling over endless fields. Even decades later, when they sat together at reunions or in quiet corners of beer halls, the memories returned in fragments. The hum of trains crossing the Midwest, the taste of real bread after years of rationing, the flicker of a match beneath a foreign sky. One man, years later, told his grandson a story that would stay with the boy forever. "When I was a prisoner," he said, "an American guard gave me a cigarette. Just one. I had not smoked in months. He didn't say anything, just handed it to me and walked away. That cigarette, I think, changed my life. Not because of the tobacco, but because for the first time I saw what it meant to be free. Not in words, but in gesture." The boy didn't understand then, but as he grew, he would recall the way his grandfather's eyes softened, the way his voice lingered on the word free. In the end, that was what endured. Not the hunger, not the fences, not even the defeat. What endured was the revelation that humanity could survive even the darkest ideologies, that kindness could infiltrate the hardest hearts. The American camps had been prisons, yes, but they had also been classrooms, unexpected schools of democracy, tolerance, and quiet abundance. For the men who lived through them, captivity had become a strange kind of liberation. Years later, when the old soldiers gathered and shared their memories, the details often blurred, but the symbols remained the same: cigarettes and chewing gum. The simplest things, the smallest tokens of a world they had once been taught to despise and which had instead taught them how to live again. They would laugh softly as they told the stories, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all, how something so trivial had come to mean so much. The smoke would rise once more, curling through the air like the past itself, fading but never gone. And if you had asked them what they remembered most, not the marches, not the surrender, not even the crossing of the Atlantic, they would tell you it was the moment they first saw a guard light a cigarette and offer it without a word. Because in that small, flickering gesture, they saw the end of one world and the quiet beginning of another.